I can see there's still people joining, so I give it a moment. I can see that a lot of people are joining from the waiting room, so once it has settled down a little bit, I will start. Maybe looking at the time, I will already start. You can see already pretty standard housekeeping rules. I'll go through them. But firstly, a great welcome to all of those that have made it today to our joint webinar between the WIOMSA team and the GIZ team. So from WIOMSA, joining us and co-organizing with us is Arthur Tudor, the director of WIOMSA, the Western Indian Ocean Science Association. That's what WIOMSA stands for. And also Deidre de Vos, who's the Marine Conservation Program Manager. And from the GIZ side, it's apart from myself, who works in Marine Conservation Program, Annika Mackinson, my colleague, who focuses on small-scale fisheries. In the GIZ, we both advisors, and our big support in the background is Carina Martens. She's our intern. So that's us. And with that, I'd like to welcome you all, colleagues and friends of the ocean, and start with the question why we are gathering here today. Well, as most of you would be aware of, with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, also known as the GBF, at the COP15 in Montreal at end of last year, we are now in a situation that the work has started now, which always gets side quoted, to really bend the curve on biodiversity loss and ultimately secure our own existence on Earth. So it's not an easy feat, and the pressure is on. So one thing to be said is, although the GBF, as again, a lot of you will know, is a comprehensive package with a lot of action targets, 23 action targets, that should stake out an integrated approach to achieving a sustainable future for us, for our existence for Earth. The most prominent target remains, that's discussed in all the discussions, is target 3, one of the 23, which includes the famous 30 by 30 quantitative target and has shifted in the focus of a lot of countries at the moment. So 30 by 30, for those who might not know, stands for trying to achieve 30% of effective conservation of the Earth's surface by 2030. So that's 7 years away. And we're quite far away. In the ocean, we're currently around 8%. So and I'm not sure, it's debatable if that's effective. So in the wake of the GBF, that old debate has reignited, so to say, and that's also the debate that we're having with my colleagues in fisheries versus conservation. It's how we can balance the need to conserve biodiversity, to protect biodiversity, with the need to use natural resources for sustainable development. So this is why we decided to do this webinar, to unpack the complexities of navigating 30 by 30 and spotlight both the potentials and the pitfalls of specifically the now very much in the spotlight other effective area-based conservation measures, also known as OECMs, terrible word, that have been widely discussed, also partly controversially, and are now seen as the new conservation tool. And we also would like to focus on African oceans and coasts in this context and the marine spaces. So yeah, we're delighted to see that a lot of you have joined. That's a reflection of the great interest in the topic. And we hope that we can demystify some of the terms for those that are not directly working with them, that we can share experiences and deepen our understanding of concepts, and also maybe through starting or continuing this conversation between the protection party and the sustainable use party to actually find a sustainable way forward with everyone on board. Yeah, so I've already placed the welcome, the housekeeping on the slide here in the background. You might see the meeting is being recorded. You're currently muted, but we'll unmute you for the interactive session a bit later. Please place any questions and comments in the chat. And in the open discussion, we also, because of the numbers of people, would like to put your questions in the chat, and then we allow some of you, or if we can, all of you, but we thematically cluster the questions, and then you can raise your hand. We'll ask you to raise your hand and you can speak for those of you who want. Okay, with this, I'll hand over to Annika, my colleague, Annika Mackinson.
Hi, thank you, Maya. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, okay, at least that works. I logged on and off a couple of times already. My camera doesn't work, which is really annoying, but at least you can hear me, that's good. So yeah, before we start with anything else and me introducing the agenda, we would like to do a little poll in the background. We want to find out a bit more about your audience, our audience. So that's you. Who are you? What's your interest in the topic? How much do you already know? So please bear with us a little bit until our tech support, Karina, diligently working in the background, posts questions and answers in the chat. And then please give a thumbs up to the answer that is most appropriate for you. So Karina, you can start. And this may take a little while until we have everything in the chat. So please bear with us, and then we can see who is joining. And please refrain from using the chat for Q&A just for a couple of minutes. Okay, so while we are doing this, Maya, please move to the agenda. We will start with our keynote speakers. We have two keynote speakers setting the scene for us from different regions in the world. The first one is SNRD and her presentation on OECMs filling the conservation gap, an opportunity to recognize and support OECMs for small-scale fishers. We will then hear Hugh Govan and his presentation on 25 years of community-based management in the Pacific Islands, LMMAs, SMAs, CBRM, VBRM, didn't know that one, ICCAs, OECMs, and other acronyms. Looking forward to that. After each keynote, we will give the opportunity for a brief comprehension question, but we'll save other questions for later. We will then have a panel discussion where our keynote speakers will be joined by Stephen and Batusoa, to be introduced later, who will both speak a little bit about different African perspectives and experiences. And this is the panel that will be moderated by our fellow colleague Arthur Tudor, as introduced from Maya already. So we will then have plenty of time for questions from the audience, enabling hopefully a good discussion, and then wrap up. Okay, so it's a bit hard for me to follow the chat now and the poll.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, maybe help me a little bit. I can see that there are a couple of thumbs up already for those that are quite familiar with the concept for LMMAs, but are not central to my work. Okay, we have few who are focusing on LMMAs.
Maybe to reiterate that you need to hover with your mouse, your cursor above the right answer, and then you see a set of reactions, and you can give a thumbs up for that answer that most reflects what your situation is. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the Polls app to work. So this is a backup option.
Okay. Now the geographical region that you're active in, so that's going to be interesting, I think.
Yeah, we still have a couple more minutes, Annika.
Yeah, okay, good. Please wait for the answers in the chat, and then we can look at the thumbs up. Okay.
I can see the numbers are coming up now.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Annika, if you can see, but we have how familiar are you with OECMs? I know nothing or little. There are a couple of people, the stage 2 people. I'm familiar with the term and know what it stands for, but I'm not sure how it practically relates to the marine conservations. We have quite a few people there, 12 at this stage. Then we have an equal amount of people whose work focuses on OECMs. And the same for if we have equivalent set of questions about LMMAs, which stands for locally managed marine areas, which is the other focus of this webinar. There are people who know nothing about LMMAs, a bit more. There are a few that are relatively familiar, and then the great majority is actually quite familiar with the concept of LMMAs, and they're not the central part of their work. That's 21 people, and then others indicated that their work focuses on LMMA. So we have a mixed bag of experts in the room. That's what we aim for, so it's great. Then regarding the sector, I don't know, Annika, can you see
yes,
the chat?
We have a couple of government representative, small-scale fisheries. Very good. Happy to see that. Environment and, good portion of NGOs attending. Okay. 7 for Development Corporation. Okay, that's also good. Okay, so maybe we just let this roll while I introduce our first keynote speaker. And then I can check back on this when we finish the first presentation, maybe. Okay, so then let's start with our first keynote speaker. That's SNRD. She is a marine researcher, conservationist, and international OECM expert with a background in ecology, indigenous knowledge, conservation management, and climate change impacts. She has recently become a member of the IUCN SSC Species Monitoring Specialist Group. She has published widely, including the seminal papers on marine OECMs and marine policy in 2022, which focuses on the recognition of OECMs in Indonesia, and that's what we're also going to hear about. She's currently an early stage researcher at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research, actually the institute where I also studied myself, ZMT, in wonderful city of Bremen, and a PhD candidate at the University of Bremen. She has 15 years of professional working experience in marine conservation and management, primarily in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle region. She is experienced in training, community facilitation, and stakeholder processes related to coastal marine conservation and management. SNRD, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annika. I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are now. As you are aware, our planet continues to deteriorate due to the presence of nearly 8 billion people. And the measure we have taken so far to protect and conserve our natural resources have proven insufficient. For the next 15 minutes, I'm going to take a look at the quote-unquote new conservation tool called OECMs and how this tool can be useful for nature and human, especially for small-scale fishers. So I'll start my talk by sharing this famous latest global biodiversity target tree. In short, um, this target aims by 2030, at least 30% of marine and coastal areas are effectively conserved and managed through protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECM, which is known as the 30 by 30 target. If this target is successful, by 2030, the area of ocean that is protected will be approximately 3.5 times the size of Africa continent. I hope I'm not wrong. With the 30 by 30 target in mind, let's start our discussions by posing several essential questions. Our first question is, what is the current extent of MPAs and OECM? Maya has informed earlier, so based on the newest data provided by the WDPA, our planet has more than 18,000 MPAs across the globe. They represent over 99% of the global marine conservation areas, currently standing at around 8%. In contrast, only 195 marine OECMs are reported globally from 6 countries, including South Africa. These MPAs and OECM have failed to achieve the 2030 CBD IG target to conserve 10% of the planet ocean, and we are still far away from reaching 30% by 2030, which is 7 more years. I won't discuss these numbers further because it needs another discussion and there's a lot of debate around this number. But however, I want to emphasize that conserving biodiversity is more than just a number. So many records shows that MPAs in many places have failed to be equitable and effective, which lead to inequities, non-compliance, and poor biodiversity outcomes. In this context, OECM recognition can play a unique role to advance sustained, effective, and equitable conservation. So which areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services are not currently protected? So imagine this beautiful island is your country with wild marine resources. In the past few decades, MPA has been the most dominant and widespread conservation tools. This happened in most countries. Besides MPAs, often there are other area-based practices that have different management objectives, either for fisheries, tourism, or cultural purposes, which each has different set of regulation and managed by specific actors, communities, private companies, or government. When they are well managed, many of these places may achieve long-term biodiversity conservation. So such places with conservation benefits is what we call as OECM. By definition, OECM has several important keywords, such as including geographically defined, it's not an MPA, govern and manage, and contribute to biodiversity conservation. OECM itself is actually not new. It's a common language or term to gather various types of area-based management tools that have been exist on Earth. So we know that MPAs and OECMs are different, but they complement each other. The main difference lies in the management objective. OECM do not need to have conservation as an objective, while MPAs should have conservation as their primary objective. So our next question is, how effective are MPAs and potential OECMs in delivering conservation outcomes? A recent study by Julie Raymer and colleagues assessed the potential ecological, social, and economic outcomes of 7 key area-based management tools. I'm sure you cannot read this bar in detail, but trust me, the green bars, like here, show there are positive effects, and the red bars show negative effect on the ecological, social, and economical outcome. And you can see that from all the tools here, almost all tools except here the last one, PSSA, particularly sensitive sea area, have dominant green bars. So if we classify these tools based on MPA and OECM's definitions, the first two are actually MPA, which is the full protected area and partially protected area. And then the remaining five are, we can categorize them as potential OECM. This include the fisheries closure, LMMA, and TER. The study demonstrated that these tools can deliver positive outcome to conservation. Another study we just published last month examined how diverse type of managed areas can deliver outcome for coral reef biodiversity. What I can highlight from this study is that both formerly protected areas, MPA here, and the areas managed by communities outside formal government protection, which can be categorized as a potential OECM here, so benefit for biodiversity conservation. Compared to areas with no management at all, which is here, managed areas were the clear winner. So from these two studies, and there are a lot of other studies, it is clear there are many ways to conserve our ocean beyond MPAs, but we need to use every tool in our toolbox correctly. So OECMs offer unique opportunities for realizing effective and equitable conservation if implemented appropriately and properly. First, they can support management aligned with local values, governance, and traditional ecological knowledge. As such, they can foster equity and inclusion of diverse value, knowledge system, and ways of achieving conservation. Second, they have the potential to advance multi-sectoral collaboration that would manage a broad suite of threats to biodiversity. Third, OECM may avoid the funding and capacity limitation that have undermined the success of many MPAs. Nevertheless, OECM also present a host of potential challenges and risks. The primary challenge associated with OECM is to avoid the blue washing. OECMs could become a real labeling exercise with no net gain or even losses for biodiversity. For example, like industrial fishing areas or like oil extraction areas might be wrongly classified as an OECM. Second, OECM could result in a narrow focus on individual sectoral impacts that would neglect cumulative threats to biodiversity. So therefore, they have limited impacts on overall biodiversity, for example, like single species protection. Uh, Third, demonstrating long-term positive conservation outcomes might be too demanding or too complex. Many of existing practices are not documented, so there are insufficient or not available evidence to provide until now. And then the last one, former OECM recognition may also pose a risk to violate the rights of local right holders. Now I'll take you to Indonesia to see the progress of OECM recognition. Located in the Coral Triangle, a region with the highest biodiversity on Earth, the Indonesian government has been very active in developing and implementing MPAs. By 2022, which is last year, the number of MPA has rapidly increased to more than 400 MPAs, spanning a total area of 28 million hectares, a little bit bigger than the size of Uganda. Indonesia has pledged to expand its MPA areas to 32.5 million hectares by 2030, but this MPA will only cover 10% of the nation waters by 2030, so it's not 30%. That also means that 90% of Indonesian seas require other resource management measures to conserve their biodiversity. So in this regard, diversifying area-based conservation tools under the OECM framework is really promising for the country. With the rich existing area-based management practices, OECM really have a huge potential to be recognized and supported in Indonesia. So to start the process, the government and stakeholders conducted an initial assessment of potential marine OECM 2 years ago. And based on this exercise, we found 14 types of area-based management that fall into the potential OECM criteria, which we chose 3 at that moment, which is not an MPA, govern and manage, and likely contribute to biodiversity conservation. We put likely because a lot of, like the majority of potential marine OECM in Indonesia were not documented. So we don't know exactly whether they contribute to biodiversity conservation or not. These types are really diverse regarding the desire to protect biodiversity as primary, secondary, or ancillary. The governing body, like either governed by the government, community, or customary communities, and by the private sector, or the primary management objective, whether they are for protection, fisheries, traditional, customary tourism, or others. And interestingly, many potential marine OECM that are traditionally managed are actually fisheries related, but we need to classify differently because in Indonesia, if it's managed by traditional or customary communities, they have completely different regulation. It is important to exercise that this exercise is only the initial assessment of what can be potentially recognized as OECM. So it's not the real OECM yet in Indonesia. Indonesia is currently on ongoing process to determining the OECM criteria and updating the policy to recognize OECM. So we don't have a formal OECM yet until now. So how much is the contribution of potential marine OECM? There are nearly 400 potential marine OECM sites widely distributed across the country. Almost half of the identified potential marine OECMs are managed for traditional and customary purpose, which many of these are fisheries related. Unfortunately, many practices, like I said before, are poorly documented and not regularly monitored. So we are largely unaware of their contribution to biodiversity conservation and social value. And we did spatial modeling lately to estimate the contribution of this potential marine OECM to conservation. Based on our analysis, these potential marine OECMs can contribute to up to 11 million hectares of marine areas, or around 3.6% of the nation waters. And each potential OECM is different in size, but the majority have size less than 50,000 hectares. These potential OECMs can add the conservation of coral reef, seagrass, and mangrove ecosystem as well in Indonesia. You can see their contribution. So there is MPA and OECM. So although their contribution are much lower than MPAs, but they actually can deliver better positive outcome to biodiversity because many are centuries old, especially the customary potential marine OECMs, and they are more well managed. While MPAs in Indonesia still have poor performance because most of them are just newly established. So I'd like to close this talk by posing my last question, which is like the most important. Why does OECM matter for small-scale fishers? So from experience in Indonesia, where 95% of fisheries are small-scale, there are a lot of benefits that small-scale fishers can gain from OECMs if the OECM is well managed. This include provide rights for traditional fishers to manage their areas sustainably, foster local leadership, support and compliance, enable the participation of fishers of fisheries organization in conservation decision-making, sustain fishery stock to a well-connected conservation network through MPAs and OECM, and bridge the divide between the fisheries and conservation communities. These communities usually work alone, so this is a good time to bridge both communities. So that's it. I'm looking forward for question and answer and the discussion later.
Thank you so much, Estra. Thank you also for excellent timekeeping. I think I didn't see any question regarding understanding or anything, so we can easily continue. Maybe, Estra, it's a good idea to post your email in the chat, because there were some questions around the study. I think someone posted it, but nevertheless, maybe that's a good idea. And then I have the honor of introducing our next keynote speaker, which is Hugh Govan, an expert on locally managed marine areas, LMMAs. Hugh holds a PhD in marine biology. He has worked with the LMMA network, which promotes community-based adaptive management in Asia and the Pacific since its inception, and is active in sharing the lessons learned to develop appropriate collaborative management approaches globally. He is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the University of the South Pacific. He is also my fellow board member in the Fisheries Transparency Initiative International Board. Hugh has been working since 1999 to help governments, NGOs, and donors to build on communities' capacities and aspirations to achieve better and more sustainable livelihoods. His current interests are developing national and provincial government systems to support decentralized natural resource management. Hugh, please take it away.
Thank you, Annika. I'm sorry that the bio is so long. Just a second, I'll share my thingy, or not. Okay, is it visible?
Yes, it's good.
Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be asked to share some of the experiences from the South Pacific. And yes, we've been putting some work into this over the last 2.5 decades. Although the areas we are looking at are usually within the line of sight of the shores, the Pacific Islands cover 100 million square kilometers of ocean, and there are more than 22 territories and countries. At the same time as it's very easy to say Pacific Islands, a crucial thing is to realize there's a very great heterogeneity or variation amongst them. Most of the people are living in a couple of lesser developed countries, but perhaps the majority of countries and colonies are experiencing relatively developed lifestyles. So it's very easy to exclude possibly the majority when you give an average impression of the Pacific. But in most cases they share, and I think perhaps some of the audience will relate to this in Africa or South America, that the governments are not spending very much on fisheries management, and particularly not on coastal fisheries management. It's not glamorous, it doesn't produce lucrative access rents and so on. But fortunately for the Pacific, many of the communities and several of the countries have strong recognize or at least do not interfere with relatively strong community rights over their areas, and quite a few of the countries have actually strengthened community rights in coastal areas. When this initiative started back in the 90s and even more recent experiences, generally the top-down marine protected area models coming from the ex-colonizers have failed. They fail, they don't take into account local situations, they don't take into account traditional knowledge, local aspirations, and so on. And so we encountered a situation with several paper parks, not that many, but several, and they were all disastrous. So in face of that, quite a few countries, actors, including some of us who coined the phrase LMMA, looked to improve the models of conservation and livelihoods in the Pacific. And those of us working on LMMAs aim to make the term as flexible and open as possible, as inclusive as possible, acknowledging that we couldn't predict exactly where it was all going to go. And so it's essentially, and another thing I would point out is we weren't precious about whether people use the term or not. So the idea was to improve community livelihoods, to improve the management of natural resources and biodiversity. And the idea was to share experiences with everybody, regardless of what label they were choosing later on to use. But anyways, essentially it's an area of coastal and marine resources, largely or mainly managed by local people. And if necessary or possible in collaboration with partner organizations and governments. Just for clarification, I'll show you some diagrams. The first thing, would be an area, the dotted line, and the most important ingredient is some sort of recognized rights over the area. In many cases, these are not legally recognized, but in the situation of developing countries, quite often the local communities have got more power to exert their rights than the government has to contradict them. And so very rapidly we managed to make use of that de facto situation. Within those areas that the community has rights over or exerts its influence over, they may choose various different approaches to ensuring the health of the fish stocks and biodiversity upon which they depend. And of course, some of the tools, and one of the ones that's most often used, are permanent closed areas, but they will also use periodically harvested areas. In other words, they may open some of these closed areas regularly or occasionally, and so these we call them periodically harvested, in other words, not permanently closed. But they may use many other rules or they call them rules, but actions or plans to bring back or protect the stocks upon which they depend. So they may ban fishing of certain species, sometimes permanently, sometimes at certain times of the year. They may restrict certain particular fishing gear types, such as spearfishing at night or gill nets. And they may also use the same organization or management planning opportunities to actually do other things, such as prepare for disasters. Well, in Madagascar, you've used these processes to actually do things like family planning and so on. There's a lot of potential there because this is a group that's organized to assess situations, figure out problems and solutions, and communicate with the outside world where necessary. So there's a lot of untapped potential so far in these groups. From our helicopter, we can see the same LMMA there with its closed area and some banned actions inside it. But in some cases, we've been able to see this spreading across whole islands, whole countries. In other words, village by village or groups of villages will have their management plans or management actions. They don't necessarily need to have a written down management plan. So what we see there is the potential for in countries, and particularly countries where there's very poor governance from government and where there's little environmental management on the shorelines, there's the potential for 100% co-management and for communities to direct efforts at tools that will specifically address the threats that they have locally. So none of this global targets or anything like this. This is, if biodiversity locally is threatened by one particular thing, let's tackle that. And of course, it's driven by something that's very tangible. That is that if it works, they don't starve. And if it doesn't work, they will be the first to suffer. Within this situation, what we've observed from some of the countries is that you may get between 5 to 30% of those areas that are managed may well be designated as more or less permanently closed, unless, of course, people need them to be open for an emergency or for a particular event. But in general, you could expect a fairly, some percentage there of permanent closures. And crucially for developing countries is that you have more management there than you ever had before, more biodiversity conservation than you would ever had before, because of, as I say, governments are, if not useless, they're actually part of the problem of destruction of the environment. And just a quick illustration of the progress in Fiji since the end of the 90s, where 1 or 2 little LMMAs were trialed. And by 2015, about 70% of the inshore fishing areas were under some sort of improved management, either with management plans, calling themselves locally managed marine areas, etc. And that involves essentially, 70% or so of the communities that live on the coast. That's excluding urban dwellers. This sort of idea grew and took off in the Pacific, and so we saw a small handful of examples, a lot of sharing of these ideas between countries. And by the last survey that I carried out, there was about 1,000 communities involved. And you don't need to read this, but there's a report with this level of detail in it. Key figures I wanted to mention were essentially about 662 sites, but we don't find the site that calling things sites are actually very useful because it doesn't get to what we're trying to get to, which is communities living better and living better in nature. And so we're having to do the inventories based on the number of communities that are benefiting from such sites, and that's around about 1,000 now. Sounds great, but it's only about 10% of the communities in the Pacific Island coastal areas, and that's after 25 years. A feature of interest for everybody is that, in fact, most of them are not legally gazetted at all. In other words, they basically got enough power or rights to state that this is what they're doing there and these are their rules, and it has been optional whether they're legal or not. In fact, not really optional, because governments are really slow at the bureaucracy involving these things. They're not suited to working with community-based processes because they're trying to set in stone something that communities are doing adaptively from day to day, and the bureaucracies are so slow that many communities just give up before anything useful's happened. Unfortunately, Stradivari mentioned the customary tenure areas, and where there are customary tenure areas, which is most of Melanesia, that's some of the biggest countries, that would be the first line of defense. And in many cases, we haven't been able to go to those 8,000 communities to find out exactly what they're doing. But when we do go, we find they are setting rules, they are defending their territories, and therefore customary tenure is probably a very effective defense against overexploitation, and probably is having biodiversity outcomes on purpose insofar as that people depend on biodiversity. Another thing that is confused in the CBD and other places is that actually in most countries that we work with, the environment agencies are junior brothers to the fisheries agencies. They don't really have much power or practice either working with local communities. So in almost all countries, it's the fisheries agencies that are working in collaboration with communities. And so that doesn't really fit under the CBD or anything else, because if any funds are generated by the idea that LMMAs or CBM is a good idea, it'll go to the wrong agencies and the wrong regional environmental agencies, or even, heaven forbid, to UNEP. Sorry. Anyway, so that's a key factor, and fisheries are probably better adapt. They've got more people on the ground, they've got boats, they can work with communities, and we need to bear that in mind. The other thing that's interesting is, for us, the OECM debate is a distraction, because countries have recognized that these sort of approaches are the most useful, in fact, possibly the only ones that will work in these coastal areas. And so, and for most of them, they've already entered these non-legal LMMAs or similar into the WDPA. And so I personally, and many of us, share a concern that the over-promotion of OECMs will continue to distract from the things that are really needed, which is not that governments recognize us. And if they don't recognize us, we're not clear that they will start recognizing us with another designation. What they don't do is they don't support communities. They're putting aside very small budgets. They've not got the staff. They're not skilling up or tooling up to work with community-based or co-management approaches. And so, you know, that if we get caught up in a technical discussion of whether something qualifies as an OECM or LMMA or MPA, we'll be missing the fact that we really need them to put all their resources into support and implementation. And looking at the debate and the designation, the definitions of OECMs, it's been clear that most of these sites have been OECMs since their establishment, many of them going back to the 1990s or early 2000s. And so there is a potential there for people to learn about OECMs, insofar as many of these sites are actually OECMs as well as recognized MPAs and so on. Just very briefly mention the importance of networks, because this took off partly because of sharing. As I say, a lot of the stuff was being done traditionally, but what was shared was that this was a legitimate approach to conservation in this day and age, and that took off quite rapidly, initially from an international network. But I have to emphasize that those are very costly, and what really is now the mainstay of the approaches is local, provincial networks, and to some extent national networks. And to finalize, well, as I say, what we're finding across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of LMMAs is that they can do quite a lot of management. They can do better management than that was there before. Their outcomes, both for conservation and livelihood, seem to be better than previously. However, they all run into the wall when it comes to the things that are the government's responsibilities. So a nicely functioning LMMA will be completely destroyed by uncontrolled mining or logging upstream, be by outside poachers that are not persecuted by the government. And so we're really crying for attention to the fact that governments are not doing their thing, and that communities are being sort of misled into thinking that they're collaborating with the overall targets achievements or whatever, when in fact they're carrying the full weight. Having said that, also we think that all communities would have the right to these benefits, and they have the right to support for community-based fisheries management. And it would be unethical to say, oh, we're going to just choose 30% of you. We've had 20 years of experience setting targets. It doesn't really work. The countries like the setting of them. They don't care very much about not achieving them. And so step by step hasn't worked. So I would say let's remember that all communities have a right for governments to support them in having a healthy environment. Two last things. We have in the region managed to work very strongly with the regional environment agencies, and so there are regional policies that show the ways forward for improving the effectiveness and the reach of community-based approaches. And possibly the biggest take-home is that community-based management, LMMAs, OECMs, and all this will depend on a very strongly principled approach and maintaining trust. And that's what I think, as a teacher and as a participant in all of this, I find the most difficult part to pass on. How do you ensure ethics, and how do you ensure that the trust that the communities have in your process are not let down? So we're at a cusp here where we might see many, many more communities joining and doing their part to ensure sustainability, but we could also disappoint them, and they could have their fingers burnt and decide not to collaborate in future. So just to finalize, here's the policies that are coming up in the region and the reports I've built this presentation from. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hugh. A lot of points for debate already. I can also see a few questions in the chat. In the interest of time, I would suggest that we take them up in the discussion later. So keep them coming in, guys, that's great. But let's now hand over to Maya to introduce our panelists, and to Arthur for moderating the panel. Thanks to you two for now.
Them being Vatusua. Vatusua, I must apologize. I actually practiced your name. Is it Rakoto Ndranzafi? But
Yeah,
I haven't written it out.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you say it much more flowy. Yeah, just you've actually become known around the world. I've seen your Impact 5 as an advocate of the rights of indigenous and local communities in Madagascar. You have also served as a national coordinator and as a president of MIHARI, which is Madagascar's locally managed marine areas, so LMMA's network, and are the founder and the CEO of Biolobe, which is Madagascar's first platform that brings together community-led conservation initiatives and aims to mobilize resources and funds to support indigenous and local communities as the guardians of natural resources. You have won awards, amongst them the Whitley Award in 2019 for your success in defending the rights of Madagascar's small-scale fishers, and have in 2021 been named as top 100 young African conservation leaders. So we feel honored and are delighted to have you here on our panel, Vatusua. Thanks so much for making the time. I will then also introduce straight away Dr. Stephen Kirkman, who's also joined us. Stephen, thanks you too for making the time. You're a specialist scientist at the South African National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment at the Oceans and Coasts branch, which provides policy and management advice in a range of matters that concern marine and coastal biodiversity. Your research and extensive publication record reflect your significant contributions to, firstly, top predator conservation, your real passion, and also, as of late, more and more marine area-based management, including marine spatial planning, marine protected areas, and also OECMs. You serve as South Africa's marine focal point for the Convention of Biological Diversity, short CBD, and coordinate the national level marine OECM process, if I may say so. It's a science-driven process. And you also play a prominent role in various national and regional scientific working groups that provide scientific expertise and guidance on area-based marine conservation, amongst others. Thank you, Steve. You're a busy man. Thanks for making the time for this important conversation. So with this, I'll hand over the moderation to Arthur, who will be taking care of the panel. Can't see Arthur yet.
I'm here, Maya. I don't know if my camera is not as good, but I don't know. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you.
All right. I think if you can hear me, that's good enough. I hope others can see me. Thank you, Maya. My name is Arthur Tudor, and welcome panelists to this segment where we're going to discuss a few issues that have come out of the presentations and also some wide-ranging interest areas with regard to OECMs. And I want to start off from where Maya has left with Vatsu. Vatsu, congratulations, because you've just moved to a new position from Mihari, where you are actually advocating for the rights and of small-scale fishers. But now I understand you have a new role at IUCN as a regional coastal oceans governance manager for Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, does this move reflect new opportunities to raise the agenda of local communities onto the regional and global stage? How do you see your new role, and how do you plan to expand your previous role to a regional and global level? Vatsu.
Yeah, thank you, Tuda, for the question. And yeah, indeed, I've dedicated the last 10 years of my career in defending the rights of IPLC and in working for LMMA expansion in Madagascar. And I was always interested, actually, to replicate our experiences in Madagascar, because as we know, Madagascar has the biggest number of LMMA. We now have about 280 LMMA in the country. And we also have our own national country network, which is Mihari. So yeah, I've always been interested to replicate that experiences in the Western Indian Ocean. And so for me, that is one of the reasons why I've got that transition from small-scale fisheries advocate into working for an international organization and more on the funder position. It doesn't mean that I'm forgetting like local communities. I'm like, for my new position, I'm still actually I'm in charge of replicating and supporting those LMMA expansion in the WIO, in sharing our best practices in Madagascar, and how I know that lots of countries in the WIO are interested actually to have their own national LMMA network. So this is part of my new position, and I can, like, I've started like 1 month ago. It's really recent, but I can say that it's quite interesting to have been on the side of small-scale fishers and now being on the side of as an international organization, because it's for me, we had some advocacy works that we've done for years, and sometimes they do not like, we cannot really get success. And now, since I'm now moving outside that sphere, that circle of small-scale fishery, they can see, we can have a better vision of how we can better support them, how can we better mobilize and engage funders, private sectors, and all the government, NGOs to better support local communities. So it's quite interesting, actually. And I think I'll just mention, for example, when I was still really working with small-scale fisheries, we were focused on advocacy, on supporting them on their rights. But now that I have that new vision, that new, I would say, new aid, there is some ideas on supporting local communities and small-scale fisheries in blue entrepreneurship. We have some with IUCN. We have also some plans on creating like a coalition of private sectors to support local communities. We have also some planning to support in how can we support small-scale fisheries to get better access to funding, what kind of mechanism, how can we better support them. And particularly about LMMA recognition, as we know, IUCN is really, I would say that, like, working on OECM, on MPA. So for me, it's really one of the biggest opportunity to really push for a recognition of LMMA in Africa, and how we can really value that concept, that I know that it's really effective, and which we really need to invest into those local communities if we want to achieve the 30 by 30, if we want to achieve all of the international pledge and all of the the objectives that we've been proposed. So that's my I hope that it answers your questions. Yeah.
All right, thank Vatsu, and we wish you well in your new role. When you talk about LMMAs in the WIO is the Western Indian Ocean region. Our reference point is always Madagascar, and Vatsu played a key role in promoting LMMAs in Madagascar. And that leads me to my question that I'll now send to Steve, on the recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities, which has been a central element of Target 3, and the previous speakers really touched on this. And this issue has been mentioned twice in Target 3 in a relatively short text. Yet perceptions remain, particularly from the advocates of minority groups, that the 30 by 30 target reinforces a top-down conservation approach. So what are your observations and reflections on this debate? Steve?
Thanks, Arthur. I was involved in some of those negotiations. It was, of course, a concern in negotiations that the negotiators of many parties had a very top-down conservation model in mind, or seemed to have in mind when discussing 30 by 30. And quite surprisingly, this seemed to include many developing countries, including African parties, that were members of multilateral agreements that were promoting the 30 by 30, such as the High Ambition Coalition. And these negotiators didn't seem very mindful of the experiences, even of the people of their own countries, with the sort of Western style and top-down protection paradigm. But ultimately, respect and recognition of IPLCs and IPLC territories became really the linchpin, I think, to having this very ambitious target agreed upon. Ultimately, IPLCs undoubtedly have a very prominent position within the framework, including in its opening paragraphs, in its section C, and then, of course, within the 30 by 30 target itself, as you said, that mentioned twice there. And I think my interpretation of the clause in there, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories, is that these should receive due recognition in the context of OECMs. That was a very big compromise, of course, for the sort of more top-down parties, and it was a very big win for IPLCs. So I do think that this gives the target really a balance between the different conservation paradigms, top-down, bottom-up, or rights-based, and everything. So in the bigger picture, the significance of or the relevance of RPLCs and RPLCs territories to in relation to this target. It's going to vary by region, by country, and also at more local levels or scales. So one would think that which model is most applicable is also going to vary likewise. So I don't really agree with the perception of those groups. Just to sum it up, I don't think it completely reinforces a top-down approach. I think it's quite balanced. The final wording, the final target language is quite balanced in that perspective. And my experience at the COP was that the RPLC representatives I met there were quite satisfied with the final language. Thanks, Arthur.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I think we'll come back to that. And I would like to remind our participants that you can post your questions on the chat. We'll have a section where we're going to interact with the panelists. So please just feel free and post your questions on the chat. And I now want to come back to Estra. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. You ended with a slide that said that OECMs are beneficial to communities, but there was an but or an if they are effectively managed. So there's a catch there. And that brings me to my question to you, because you've been involved in OECMs for a long time. You're recognized as a specialist, and you've been developing guidance materials for the implementation of marine OECMs. So what are the current needs and developments in this regard for different countries?
Thank you, Arthur. I think there are several important matters that each country needs to understand. First is to make sure that OECMs is aligned with local values, governance, and traditional knowledge system. And each country would have different values, different governance, different traditional knowledge system. Like, for example, LMMA in Indonesia, we don't have any formal recognition under the government's regulation yet, for example. So, but in other countries they may have. So everything is completely different between countries. So you need to understand what is best for the OECM, and it should align with local values. And the second one that is also really important is to understand the risk of doing OECM. So there are a lot of risks that I already mentioned earlier, and the risk could be different per site, per region, per country. So if you understand the risk from the beginning, then it's much easier to think about what kind of OECM that could work for your country. Last thing that I would like to emphasize as well, it's really important for the policymakers to agree on targets that are based on outcomes. Because lately I see that a lot of policymakers want to achieve the numbers, the coverage, number of MPAs, areas. And we all know, especially like the scientists who used to do a lot of different studies, number is just number. What matters is the real contribution that the OECM and MPA can provide for the biodiversity conservation. So yeah, 3 things.
Thank you. 3 good points. And I want to now to turn my question to Hugh. Hugh, thank you for your presentation. And 20 years plus working with government, NGOs, donors, in building the capacities and aspirations of local communities to achieve better and more sustainable livelihoods. And we've seen that you've worked intensely in the Pacific, and we've shown an impressive work of LMMA networks. But you also mentioned some challenges that have come across with your efforts to try and promote LMMAs in the Pacific. So do you see ways to achieve necessary enabling factors for more LMMA networks elsewhere? So what lessons can we draw from the Pacific that us who are in the Western Indian Ocean can learn from on how this has worked for you in the Pacific, and what do we need to have as the necessary enabling factors for this to be possible?
Oh, thanks for that. Well, I would say that, I mean, during the time that we've been working on this, and as I hate to try to take the credit for LMMA or anybody else, because I believe the most effective approaches are selfless. In other words, you're encouraging local actions. You can't put your label on that. But to say that they've changed the definition of MPA once or twice during this time, they keep on setting new targets without asking developing countries or the people on the ground. So I think this is a big challenge, that essentially this is a political issue. The world is under a kind of new wave of colonialism, where we're, you know, the countries that have actually destroyed the planet are actually now imposing the solutions on countries before we hear how they think that they should address the threats. And so this is a very big challenge in mindsets, north, south, and so on. The fact that we're not geared up to hear from the ground or countries what the most useful investments would be, because at the end of this, the 30 by 30 is a finance raising tool, and we know where the finance is going to go, and it will very, very little of it will trickle down to the grassroots. So again, in countries like developing countries, the majority that I'm interested in, they have major challenges in health, education, and so on. And so the governments understandably are not putting a big enough budget into environmental management or conservation. I think that first they should be given the money. Later on, us civil society will claim, will make a noise about them not spending it on the right things. But at the moment, they can justly say that they face bigger challenges, immediate challenges, and so they cannot invest in community-based management or any other kind of protection. So first, I think we should be thinking, you know, why does a couple of $100,000 annual budget in fisheries in a small country in the Pacific not get, you know, some of the millions that are going to NGOs in the same country? So these are really big challenges, I think, that we should be thinking about. In terms of the way we think it's scaled in the Pacific, or could scale, it's an enabling environment, including the budgets, but other things like information accessibility to communities. I would recommend looking at those the scaling strategies that we have for the region, because I think a lot of the things there would be useful for how to achieve maximum engagement of communities in doing better management. Again, I think we should not get lost in whether these count as an MPA or an OECM or an LMMA or anything. We want people to be more active stewards and able to get out of the trap of having to feed their families and make their livings at all immediate costs. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I've got a couple of other things, but just the final point is that, again, in the change of definitions of MPAs, actually MPAs, LMMAs perfectly well qualify as an MPA, again, if government feels like it. MPAs, the definition, again, was driven by the North, but we did make as much noise as possible. And the conservation objective only has to be primary if it's threatened by any of the other multiple objectives an MPA can have. And nobody is more interested than communities in a long-term conservation outcome. So we were promised a debate in the Pacific about how you would tell whether long-term, short-term, opening a closed area for a year or a month is actually counter to conservation, or whether it's long-term conservation. And again, the definition of conservation, I think I would prefer to take one from Indigenous peoples than from a committee in Canada. So I think we shouldn't write off MPAs. As I say, the countries in the Pacific didn't have a problem with designating LMMAs as MPAs.
Thank you, Hu. That's a very interesting discussion. But I like something you say that, yeah, we have all these definitions, but bottom line is we should promote good stewardship of the ocean. I think bottom line is good stewardship. And now, Stephen, Hugh has told us about the challenges of LMMAs and all the factors that we need to look at to make them successful. But from a South African perspective, what are the greatest challenges for reaching 30 by 30?
Thanks, Arthur. I'm gonna assume you're referring to our sort of marine space. We are more familiar, more relevant here, although I'm sure there's a lot of commonalities with the issues in the terrestrial space and also with issues elsewhere. We've got a very complex history of marine and coastal resource or biodiversity protection and management in South Africa. But I'll name some of them, what I think are some of the greatest challenges, certainly not the only ones. And one of them clearly being, the competing interests in the marine space for resources, for space, etc. Apart from the increasing populations and demand for marine resources, we've set very ambitious goals in the country for developing our ocean economy. This would see growth in several sectors, including in extractive sectors. So integrating an ambitious area-based conservation target with this, it's obviously always going to be challenging, and this is especially the case for the more coastal and inshore areas where competing interests are greatest. And I think in these areas we'll be very keenly looking at the potential role of OECMs there as well. Secondly, also fundamental opposition to protected areas or to more protected areas. This includes from sectors such as fishing, where there's a prevailing sentiment that protected areas are at odds with the sort of conventional fisheries management approaches. But then also, of course, with local communities, local coastal communities, and that in the context of experiences with historical top-down protection in South Africa, with associated with that dispossession and loss of access and rights, and including along racial lines, of course, in apartheid South Africa. So this has had considerable implications for recognition of protected areas, the existing protected areas, and compliance with these protected areas, let alone, introducing these ones. So I think the two issues I've mentioned so far, these are really fundamental issues that are going to need, they're going to require considerable engagement from a very high level right down to grassroots level. And exploring of the existence and the role of OECMs is also going to be key to this. And then, of course, add to this other issues, the issues of financing and resourcing, not only for expansion of conservation area, but to ensure that that both the existing protected areas and the new ones are effective. And certainly, lack of evidence that the current protected areas are being adequately managed and are producing results that they are intended for. That's going to really affect the appetite among stakeholders for new protected areas and so on. So these are some of the main challenges to us at the moment, but by no means the only ones, Arthur.
Sure, thanks. So 30 by 30, high ambition, but of course it's not without challenges. So, and we have a very short time to surmount all these challenges. And yeah, so Vatsu, tell us about some of the strategies that you applied to improve representation and participation of small-scale fishers. You've heard from Hugh's presentation and also from Estra how it's been happening in the Pacific and Indonesia, and you've been involved a lot in Madagascar with, promoting representation and participation of small-scale fishers. So would you just tell us, what do you see as necessary to counter the potential challenges in the design and implementation of OECMs from your Madagascar experience, and now you're looking at the bigger Western Indian Ocean region? What are some of these potential challenges in the design and even the implementation, given that we have not experienced these like Pacific and other places? What are these challenges that you foresee?
Yeah, thank you, Archie. I think I will talk first about the experiences, like how can we strengthen the voices of those local communities, because we know, like for the case of Madagascar, I think most of small-scale fishers, they're among the poorest and the most vulnerable population in the world. And for the case of Madagascar, those communities were marginalized, they were isolated. they didn't have access to opportunities in general. It's really like forgotten people. And then they took the initiative to first to create LMMA, so they can design, they can decide on which area they want to protect. And then in 2012, they took the decision to create Mihari. So for me, it's really that initiative from communities to protect their resources and also to cover into a network that is first a good, I would say, best practices, because they know that their voice could be strengthened. They know that through a network, they can share experiences, they can get capacity building. And this is what we have done with Mihari, actually, like building the capacity of those communities, defending their rights at the national and at the international level, advocating for a legal recognition of those local communities. So this is one of the ways where we really made sure that the voices of those communities were heard. So just talking about the case of Madagascar, I think one of the biggest success that we've made, and which, as we know, we had that issues between small-scale fisheries and industrial fisheries in terms of the use of the ocean. So we've supported local communities to draft a kind of motions. One of the motions were actually they requested from the government the creation of an exclusive fishing zone for small-scale fisheries. It was a long, I would say, long advocacy work, and where we had to meet with the ministries, we had to meet with industrial fisheries. But at the end, it like the local communities won, because like we got like engagements from our minister at that time, where he accepted to support local communities to get that like reserved area for small scale fishers, so they can operate peacefully, they can fish peacefully. And we got also legislation after that, where we had like 2 miles from the sea should be like industrial fisheries cannot operate into that 2 miles. Unfortunately, those legislations are not always respected, but at least we got that engagement to support local communities. So this is what I can share. And then for the WIO in general, that's why I've mentioned at the beginning that I was really interested. I have always been interested into networking, because for me, if you just have one voice, it's really difficult to get heard. It's really it's really create the challenge would be, how can we create those national networks of small-scale fisheries or local communities or LMMA or ECM, and then cover a regional voice at the Western Indian Ocean, which would be really, really powerful, because this is really, lots of countries giving hands, and which would be more powerful. Yeah.
Thank you, Vatsu. And I want to remind participants that we are coming shortly to the section where we're going to interact with the panelists. So please just post your questions on the chat. We'll try to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions, and so we're going to create time for that. But now I want to enter into the last segment of questions, short answers from all the panelists, as we prepare to get into the discussions with the other participants. So I'll start with you, Estra. And my question to you would be, now with all the challenges we've seen with the previous models of marine conservation, MPAs, we've heard about the top-down nature that were imposed on communities, and some places, many of them do not work. So do you think OECMs offer an opportunity to redress some of the mistakes conservation has made in the past by being more inclusive of indigenous people and local communities? Do you think they will help address some of the shortfalls of the traditional conservation models that have been applied in the past?
Yes, I think OECM still brings a huge opportunity to overcome some failures that MPAs or like other kind of existing conservation effort that didn't work. But of course, OECM comes with risk as well. Like I had mentioned previously, blue washing. So we have to be very careful to prioritize what can be included, what can be recognized as OECM. So it doesn't mean like everything could be labeled as OECM. OECM doesn't also mean that you need to create something new. in many cases, it's just real labeling. Like you put stickers, so you already have good LMMA, for example, in a country, and you feel like, oh, okay, this is can be an OECM because it fits with the definition. So we put the sticker. This is OECM. So you don't really have to create something new because there's a lot of misconception. OECM is something new, so it's a new tool, it's a new toy, so people start to create something new. It's the same when you come to the communities and say, hey, we have OECM, that would be difficult to explain. But if you say, oh, we are doing LMMA, for example, in Indonesia, LMMA is also a big thing. And we say that to the community, we want to develop LMMA. It works in this island and we want to replicate here. It's much easier than you come to a community and say, hey, I want to make an OECM. So basically, like I mentioned previously, OECM is just like a common language, like a common term that we use all together because there are a lot of different practices beyond MPAs. They are really good, but none of them, or very few of them, are recognized to contribute to conservation. It is also important to show what works. So in this case, there's a lot. I think the role of science is really important to see the existing practices that really work. So that could be prioritized, but those that probably in the gray area, so maybe could be put in a parking lot for later discussion. So now just focus the effort on prioritizing actions. Then to discuss, to debate a lot of things about OECMs.
Thank you. They say a rose by any other name will still smell as sweet. So if we change from LMMS to OECMs, it's still a rose. Anyway, Hugh, in your keynote, you made a point that LMMAs can take on a diversity of shapes. Do you foresee that some can easily contribute to global conservation targets? And if so, what would be a benefit or incentive for local communities to contribute to the reporting?
Well, I mean, that is a thorny question. I can tell I'm not going to make a lot of friends, but a question is, why would communities want to count towards the targets? There seems to be a misapprehension that being recognized by government gets you any benefits, but we have not seen governments giving benefits, whether they're legally recognized or not. And if there are indeed many threats still outstanding, then it might be better for government to address them than for us to blue wash them into thinking that they've achieved something. That leads me to the point I made earlier about effectiveness, because, and I think Steve said it very well, is we all have a burning need for the MPAs that were designated 10, 20 or 100 years ago to be effective. The ones that we all agreed were vital should be 100% effective. Save that turtle nesting beach or whatever. And it's not lost on communities that many of those areas are not being well protected by government. And so it's the other point corollary to that is what communities do may not meet the highest standards of effectiveness for a biodiversity conservationist or whatever. They don't seem to grasp that this is better effectiveness than nothing. These are outcomes that include conservation of biodiversity, but also include conservation of fish stocks, include guardianship of mangroves, include somebody that's there actively managing. These are not properly measured when people say, is it effective? Of course, it's not effective as taking the population out of an area and leaving the area completely well guarded, if you're talking about only biodiversity, but we're not. In most of the countries we're working in, we're talking about a whole complex series of factors and interests. And if you undermine the people's interests, you might end up with a much worse situation with people against conservation and actively forced to poach and to predate more to survive. So I think that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, kind of. Thank you, Hugh. As you say, it's a Tony subject. But as we wind up, I don't know if any of the panelists has got a question for the other panelists. I have some 3 minutes for the panelists to wind up. So if you want to make some reflection from what other panelists have contributed, or you have a question for other panelists, please, this is your time. as we wind up this segment, and then we go now into looking at the way forward and involving other participants to also ask their questions. All right. Okay, then if that be the case, then maybe one last reflection from Batsu about reconciling conservation and sustainable resource use. And now we've embarked on the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Target. So what opportunities do you see that helping us in reconciling conservation as we know it and sustainable use in 1 minute as we close this segment?
Yeah, thank you to the. I think I'll talk about. I've mentioned about the 30 by 30, so I'll just say again what I've said about investing in communities. So I think at this stage, it could be really how can we value and invest in small-scale fisheries, and this is why I've mentioned about the locally driven trust fund or small-scale fisheries trust fund, where we can really give the power to local communities, because to really invest in them, the solution would be really giving them access to funding, like a bottom-up approach of funding, where local communities can design and implement projects. Thanks.
And Steve, do you agree with what Vatsu has just said? Steve, are you still there with us? All right, so as Steve ponders on that, we will now welcome Maya and Anika. Are you around to see who has asked questions so that we can send our questions to the panelists?
Yes, I have tried to keep track of a very active chat and listen at the same time. So yeah, thanks so much. There have been more questions than we can probably address at this stage. Yeah. But I just tried to cluster them and you know, see where there's most interest. So I think my first question, Hugh, you had a lot of questions. They concerned how you engage communities, but also the effectiveness of generally LMMAs. I think since you've addressed that in your last answer, I would like to focus on community engagement, and a couple of questions around saying, how did you manage to engage the communities in the CBFM? And how do you engage local communities in all aspects of science, for example, in setting fisheries replenishment zones? Can you maybe answer to those?
Okay, well,
maybe just before he answers, sorry, if we can know if who asked the question. So sometimes it's important. I don't know if you can maybe,
Yeah, I will. At the beginning, I didn't take note of that. So these two were right from the start. So apologies. I will try to do that.
All right, thank
for
you.
The next lot.
All right.
Yeah, I was just going to say one key thing was in the LMMA, it's not always the same for all the CBFM, but one thing was to set very clearly from the outset some principles of working. And this was full respect for communities and that they drive the process. And this means that even if they don't, for example, with scientific advice, even if we do have the luck of having a biodiversity survey beforehand and that identifies where the best protected area might be, the community ultimately would decide whether they use that tool and where they deploy it. They will be able to consider the advice, but it's not overridden, it's not overriding. So this principle-based approach is critical because LMMAs are community driven. In other words, we have to take the leap of faith that if we assist them in meeting their natural resource management needs because of their situation in terms of livelihoods depending on these marine resources, that there will also be a conservation outcome. Now, that isn't such a big a leap of faith as it is saying we will enforce in conservation and you're all going to be better, which is what I've been seeing in the literature, you know, that MPAs will help livelihoods, help climate change, etc. Well, actually, I think it's more reasonable that local stewards meeting their needs sustainably would actually have spin-offs on conservation. So that's how the LMMAs take off so well in a region in situations where government is not seen to be particularly providing these livelihood needs. The story that communities can do it for themselves and that people can support them and put in advice and scientific advice and so on that goes down very well. I think that was the question.
Yes, thank you. We have actually a hand up by Jackie. Maybe we can allow her to ask a question herself. That is Caro. Can you unmute Jackie, please? Maybe I think that hasn't worked yet, but while you manage to unmute Jackie Sunday, maybe Jackie, raise your hand again, then we can see you up top. We hear someone else, I think. So maybe mute every.
Jackie, you can unmute yourself now. I cannot open your microphone. I can just make happen so you're able to unmute yourself.
My apologies. Thank you very much, Chair Maya, and also Hugh. Just on this point, is there a way in which we can amplify these two critical principles that you've mentioned in the process of trying to promote this target? Because for me, I think that that's going to be key, that there is this understanding that most importantly, we've got to support the devolution of power and community-based, really solid, good, sustainable management at local level. And if we can get those principles right, then I think some of these sorts of technical issues around OECMs will become less important, but we'll be achieving the ultimate targets. Thank you.
You want to take that, Hugh?
Okay. Yeah, just briefly, I think yes, good question, Jackie. And I think that again, we need to break free from a mindset of targets and so on, and think what is needed. I think that a lot of the speakers have already, for example, talked about small-scale fishing, the people who are using the coasts. So personally, I'm putting all of my last decade's worth of energy into that, because these are the stakeholders we're talking about. And therefore, what she did in Madagascar is a really good example. I think if we can exclude industrial fishing from inshore zones, if we can make sure that communities have rights, whatever they then go on to do in terms of MPAs or ECMs or whatever, I think we'll already see a lot of the pressure coming off. It doesn't go down well because this is not a project that's easy to help with. It's very boring for most of the activists on the ground. You have to actually, you can speak better to lobby for exclusion zones and then to enforce them, which is even more difficult. But that gives a lot of space for communities to take the actions that they feel necessary, and gives us another paradigm for conservation and management. So I think the rights, particularly tenure rights, and also, of course, awareness that there's not that very many other ways that they're going to be able to deal with these populations if they don't help them manage their resources. In other words, they're going to have a lot of very hungry people in these really remote areas that governments will be responsible for.
Thank you, Arthur. I will just tackle the next point, if I may.
Yeah. All right.
That is actually, thanks, Fatusua. I see you've already responded to some questions in the chat, and they concerned the limitation of funding that obviously gets raised a lot. There's a question that I would ask. It's by Desiree Schwindenhammer from the University of Freiburg. Desiree, are you able to speak for yourself and ask a question regarding the redirection of funds? Or should I raise the question for you? I hope that's quick. So if you could raise your hand, Desiree, and then we can quickly let you unmute yourself. Okay, I'll ask it. Thank you. So the question is, what can development cooperation do to redirect funds in a way that they benefit governments and or local communities' management capacities? Vatusua, you've just moved into a regional space, so I'm sure you have some ideas how the world can aid these processes.
Yeah, sorry, Maya. Would you mind please repeating the question? Sorry.
Yes, sorry if it got jumbled. So the question was, what can development cooperation do to redirect funds in a way that they benefit governments and or local communities' management capacities?
Yes, yeah, I think I would say first, like the idea is really to how can we avoid top-down approach? So really maybe bring like a paradigm change, like I've mentioned at the beginning of my call about the creation or the establishment of locally driven trust fund, where the idea is really to create that re-granting mechanism, because we know that most of the funders, it's difficult for them to really provide funding to grassroots communities based on criteria and administrative issues. So the idea would be really to support the development of re-granting mechanism that can provide seed funding for local communities, and where local communities can apply for those small seed funding, be supported in writing proposals and in writing reports, but it really create the creation of agencies like locally driven trust fund that support local communities. So for me, that's maybe the idea, like a new innovation or new mechanism funding where we just establish those locally driven trust fund. And the idea would be also maybe doing some consultation at the grassroots level to ask communities about what kind of project are they interested to implement, how can they own the project, how can they design it, because the issue now is like lots of communities are starting to be not motivated anymore to do conservation, because for them funding is focusing too much on biodiversity conservation, when the needs of communities are not about conservation. Their needs is getting access to health, to education, to food security. So how can funding be given to communities where they can do conservation, but also that look into their livelihood? So the idea is really that re-granting mechanism that can just give seed funding into a like an holistic approach. Yeah.
Thank you, Watusua. Any other panel members want to weigh in there? Yeah, Hugh, go for it.
Yes, that's true, and it's very important. And also, some of us are working on that as well. And it would be great to share experiences, because it is very difficult, given just the example of the Pacific with 10,000 communities. How do you make a fund that will be accessible to them and reach a great proportion of them? Having said that, the hand in hand with that are the services that communities cannot get for themselves. Sometimes that's information, sometimes that's legal rights, and so on. And so we're also lobbying for such trust funds to be made that would be accessible to governments. In other words, if a government does not have the funding or the capacity to support community-based management, then let's not let it be money that's the problem. So we set up a trust fund that's governed appropriately, that they should be able to access it to supplement their coastal fisheries management budgets. And then if they do, well, they are doing it for the right reason, hopefully, and we can monitor their progress. And if they don't, somebody else could step in and deliver the information or get lawyers involved or whatever. So I think we, unfortunately, my first love is with communities, but more and more I've had to work at the part I don't like, which is governments. And these are the kind of things we need to weigh up to balance the community-based management to make sure that it's not happening in a vacuum.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe also regarding to funding, there's a lot happening in all sorts of sectors, including our development corporation that I represent currently, to mobilize private funding, because we just don't have enough public funding sources available. So I mean, there's a lot happening. I see that it was picked up in the chat already, and actually Watusua also is onto that. So thank you for that. I'd like to also swing back. I mean, there have been other questions, probably more towards the, if we want to see it in a polarized way, the protection side of the story, the other side of the coin of this seminar today. I'd like to address a question to Stephen. Steve? And that is by Fikri Jarudin. I don't know if you'd like to ask a question yourself, then please raise your hand. I can't see it currently. I will just read the question, and then if you have anything to add, you can raise your hand. Go for it, he says. I hope it's he. Sorry if I can't place a name to gender. So we your question is, we just failed to meet Aichi target 11 by 2020, but then moved on with a more ambitious 30 by 30 target. Are we confident enough to meet this target by 2030? If so, how confident are these new MPAs plus OECMs in effectively contributing to GBF targets? I think, Steve, you would probably be well placed to respond to that.
Thanks, Maya. I can try. So indeed, we didn't meet the Aichi targets, especially in the case of marine, and the global 30 by 30 target greatly increases that ambition, and we only have 7 years to meet it. How realistic is it? I'm really not sure how realistic it is on a global scale, and I think the contributions in areas beyond national jurisdiction are also going to be relevant there, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to unfold. At a national level, it's really going to vary by country, and I think in South Africa, for example, we have endorsed the targets. In fact, it's become the sort of apex target of how we're going to address our conservation and sustainable use strategy in the country going forward. But there's a recognition that we're not likely to achieve it by 2030. We ultimately want to aim for 30%, but there's a recognition that we're going to take longer. We don't want to. One doesn't want to rush things. One doesn't want to compromise long-term benefits by short-term gains that aren't going to have meaningful conservation benefits or might alienate communities, etc., etc. So there's got to be a balance towards how we're going to achieve it. I'm speaking here from a South African perspective. So, from the point of view of OECMs, it's a very new concept to us here in South Africa. We're still really trying to understand that in our marine space, but it's likely that we will need to really explore those options and not just formally protected areas. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you very much. I just see Vatusua has to leave us. Thanks so much for making the time. We will continue with our discussion, and thanks for contributing. And we'll keep up the flag for LMMA.
Yes, of course. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, Estra, you have your hand up. I had a question for you from the chat too, but maybe come in first. You are muted, I think, Estra.
Okay. So I'd like to add what Steve has mentioned before. So it's really, from the question, it's really depending on who we are. Are we like policymaker? Are we scientists? Are we communities? So it's really hard to have one answer for the FICRE questions. But looking for Indonesia, for example, it's really diverse based on country or who we are. In Indonesia, when in 2020 we tried to evaluate what's going on with the progress of marine conservation, and we know that we failed to achieve the 2020 Aichi target. What I like from that process, the government and stakeholder, we sit together and then we evaluated what happened, why it failed, and then we make a roadmap for the next 10 years. So we try to be realistic as possible. And then that's the reason why Indonesia only is confident enough to achieve only 10% conserved marine areas by 2030, not 30%. The next target for Indonesia to achieve 30% is by 2045, which is like more than 20 years from now. So I think, and then for OECM itself, because it's really new for Indonesia, although Indonesia has many different type of practices, existing practices before, but like in regard formalizing those practices into a legal framework is still something new. So Indonesia doesn't really put OECM as part of the achievement or like target to achieve the 30 by 30. So I think what I can share to others, maybe it's really important to see what's possible to be done in your country. Prioritize what is the most important things to do for the next 7 years. I know the ambitious target is already there and we try to achieve together, but we have to be realistic at the same time.
Thanks for this addition, and also sharing your experience in the implementation. I have a question for you, Estra, from the chat, and that is, I think, a question a bunch of us had already. One of the obstacles is that it's very difficult to explain OECMs to locals in one short sentence or in a short, very clearly and shortly. Do you have a solution? Have you found a solution? And if you have, can you please share that?
Unfortunately, no. Even like in Indonesia, we already have several workshops and we try to translate or like make a term in Bahasa. We don't have the right terms yet. So I don't have experience, but what I feel in like, you don't really have to explain about OECM, especially if you go to the communities that already have existing area-based management practices. Just continue on with that. I mean, OECM is more like a policy term language. It's just like MPAs. I mean, like when MPA was started decades ago, nobody knows about MPAs. They just know that you need to close an area and don't do anything. And that's what the community knows. And that's okay. I mean, eventually they will learn about MPAs. You don't really have to make sure that they understand the full concept of OECM and the term itself. Just use whatever already available, what they know, and then try to improve from that. But yeah, I mean, I don't have any experience yet how to explain OECM to communities. Even for policymakers, is also difficult.
Yeah, that's the tricky part and a little bit of an obstacle that remains. I think communication will probably be an important aspect going forward. Well, then there's a question by Hugo Costa. Hugo, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but are you able to speak yourself? Would you like to raise your hand? The question is regarding if you, it's actually directed to Hugh and Estra. If you could comment on a statement. Here, Hugo, we will. Yes, can you please introduce yourself with a sentence?
Hi.
And you can ask a question. I don't know if you remember which one I'm referring to.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Hugo Costa. I am the Marine Program Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society in Mozambique, and we work with small sustainable fisheries, small scale fisheries to make them sustainable. So my comment, it's more like a comment, but it seems to me that from the discussion, OECMs, as I think it was mentioned before, act more like a label. So for governments, they can definitely be interesting if they want to report more on achieving with target 3. These areas are usually small, so they do not contribute as much as that, but they can increase, and they can increase the area by reporting something they are not effectively investing on, just communities. But for communities, it seems that the biggest benefit would be then to have some additional type of funding or technical support for the day-to-day activities, and not actually more than that, because as it has been mentioned, it's really hard to explain to communities, and communities don't want to know about that. It can actually be confusing if there are already other terminologies in the country, etc. It can really mess up their minds. So my question and comment was actually to have some ideas about this. If this, at least this would be true, like governments would benefit from OECMs for accountancy of the targets, and communities technical or probably more important, financial support. Thank you.
Who would like to go first? Esther?
I'm happy.
Or you?
Oh.
Are you happy?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
I think an interesting thing. I mean, I think that an interesting thing is that the 2008 definition of MPAs swung conservation away into a sort of strict conservation mindset, and the OECM definition in terms of this debate reopens the door that already existed in terms of sustainable use, and means that they're, instead of being measured by strict objectives, that the outcome of an area would also count. So if the outcome can be measured as some sort of conservation, then that area now also it falls back into the folder, if you wish, of marine protected areas, target 3, etc. So that's useful. I think that again, and I think Stradivari has mentioned, these are labels. I don't think a community ever needs to hear about OECMs or LMMAs or MPAs. The important thing is what they do. If they call it something that makes them feel proud of their initiative, then so much the better. And it's just us technical advisors and lobbyists and so on that should be clear on how all of this works and able to open those doors or not. And I think also we have to be clear that if it's a case, and I very rarely come across them, that a government would help more because we found a label for it. Usually they're not helping because they've got their own reasons, and they'll find many more excuses not to. But anyway, that's my short comment.
Yeah, sorry, just one comment on that. I wouldn't say not for the government, by international community, cooperation, development, etc. That kind of support that could then be directed to the communities. And just also as an example, in Mozambique, for example, there is one type of protected areas which are sustainable use marine protected areas, where LMMAs would actually fit, right?
Esther, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add. So first of all, every government would like to pursue OECM. Whether they will do OECM or not, it depends on each country. But because the CBD has been agreed by almost 200 governments, so it means like each nation needs to contribute to the target. So it means they have the responsibility to do OECM in the future. But in regards of funding to communities, it really depends on what kind of OECM. In Indonesia, if we talk about customary potential OECMs that are related to customary, and they're already there for centuries, sometimes they don't need funding because it's already there. They just need to continue what they're doing. What they need is the recognition. So having OECM, it will give them the rights to do what they want, formal rights. So, for example, they can manage their area. In Indonesia, it's a little bit different because based on our law, everything's natural resources are controlled and owned by the government. So basically, local communities don't have any rights to own, to do something with natural resources, especially the marine resources. So having OECM, it will give them the rights to manage their area, and that's what they need. So that other actors cannot come and then do whatever they want in that marine resources because it's now managed by the communities. So in many cases, Indonesia, the communities doesn't need any funding. They just need the recognition, but they don't have the capacity to report, to declare, to identify their practices as OECM. So then maybe in that case, the funding can go to for example, the CSO or like NGOs to help the community to recognize their OECM or to declare their practices as OECM. So again, it will be depending on the type of OECM. Maybe some OECMs, like more like fisheries related OECM, may need funding, but customary OECM, for example, they don't need funding. So it's really depending on the needs and local context.
Thank you. With that, we are unfortunately, as much as I think the conversation could continue, we are nearing our end. So I will ask Arthur to come back. I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you.
If you have some closing words.
Thank you, Maya, for helping with that question answer time. I think I would have done terribly with sorting out the questions. And I want to thank you very much. I think we have run out of time, and I want to thank all the panelists and all the participants for the questions. I know we have a long list of questions that we're going to put together and have this probably in a follow-up webinar that we'll be telling you about very soon. But at this point, I want to hand over back to Annika to take us through the closing sessions. Annika, if you're there.
Yes, thanks, Arthur. Yeah, my camera is still not working, maybe for the best, I don't know. Anyway, quick wrap up. I want to mention this briefly. I've really tried to get a representative from a small-scale fisheries organization on board. I couldn't find anyone, and I think this is also something that is telling in a way. So let's not stop the conversation here. Let's take everyone on board. Really, that's my take-home message also for everyone to share. I want to wholeheartedly thank all speakers, panelists, participants of what I thought was a great discussion. I certainly learned a lot today. I got tired at some point with the term OECMs already. So now this has sparked a lot of energy from my side, at least. And maybe, yeah, just to say, Maya and I, by default, by the way our jobs are set up, work at the end of different spectrums, but we really enjoy working together. So I think if we all keep our channels open in that spirit, that would be great. Special thanks to Karina and Anton, who have worked so much in the background. Thank you so much. We want to thank SNRD Africa and the GIZ Blue Network. Obviously, we thank WIOMSA for this beautiful collaboration, Lillian, Deirdre, and of course you, Arthur. And yeah, for everyone, we will send out a recording soon. We are obviously open to feedback on this format. We hope everybody took something home today. Let's continue the discussions in our respective networks and keep the ball rolling. On that note, I want to draw your attention to a few events coming up. So there is an event by FAO and WIOMSA, a webinar on fisheries-related OECMs, which will be held online by March 15th next year, 2024. We can share the dates with you in our emails. There will also be a WIO regional OECM workshop by WIOMSA. The date is not set yet, but keep your eyes open. And a WIOM PAN meeting or learning workshop 1st to 4th of November, where the first day also will be on OECMs. So with that, I will finish. Thank you all, and let us know if you want us to continue the discussions. We can set up another webinar at some point if you like this. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.